Oh, and I haven't even said anything yet. Well, thank you, Tony, for a very kind introduction, and thank all of you for taking your time to come to the talk today, either physically or virtually. If you did make it to the auditorium, I'm going to impose one extra small burden on you, and that's we're relying on you to let us know if we're audible and making sense and it's all holding together. Right. Levon has kindly agreed to work in relay with me. We will try to keep the baton passes smooth, but again, let us know if anything is not making sense. We'll rely on Donna out there somewhere in virtual space to do the same for the folks in the webinar. Okay, so briefly, as the title says, what we're going to do is try to summarize our initial few years of experience in building and really testing this network called PEDSnet. So being pediatricians, we tend to think in developmental terms. We think of ourselves in our research network or informatics toddlerhood, taking our first steps and not quite falling flat on our face. And what we wanted to do was share the experiences of getting to, through pulls to stand, to take steps independently, and maybe providing some information about the utility of the network, maybe providing some information that in your work will help you not to fall flat on your face. We're going to try to alternate as well between more sort of informatics-focused content and broader content about the research goals of the network. All right, so here's a brief outline of the talk, and you can see we're going to divide it into sections that Levon and I will go back and forth on. Hopefully, as I said, they will hold together well. All right, I want to start by grounding the principles behind PEDSnet in the broader notion of learning health systems. And if you spend much time in the clinical informatics world, I'm sure that this is a term that you run into about as often as you run into advertisements for burgers and fries. Right? The term itself sort of gained popularity after a series of IOM reports late in the last decade. And the underlying rationale is actually fairly straightforward. One of the things we've seen over the last 25 to 30 years is that as medical systems, we're getting much better at collecting, storing, organizing, and making available lots of information about our patients. Right? You know, we have, as medical and nursing and similar professions, a long tradition of collecting and storing and using information about our patients, but most of that was very individual-centric. Right? At the very least, I might write out a sheet full of unintelligible abbreviations and hope that the pharmacist got them right. Right? Whereas now what we're doing is we're approaching this much more at a systems level. And the notion of learning health systems follows from the principle that as we get better at operating as a system, we have both a sort of self-serving interest as a system, but more importantly, we have an ethical duty to our patients to use that information not just to run a better hospital enterprise or a better insurance plan, but to actually take better care of our patients. That part of the social contract that we have with the patient we take care of today is that understanding that the information that they entrust us with today or the problems that we solve for them today are going to make it better the next time they come to see us or the next time a patient comes to see us for a similar reason. So the notion here is that the health system needs to learn, not just the healthcare provider. The problem here is we don't quite understand what we're about. Right? Everyone here at CHOP has spent a fair amount of time interacting with Epic, either directly or through downstream systems like the CDW, and you know that we're really good at collecting information and piling it up somewhere. We don't yet have a good systematic understanding of what that information means, where exactly the knowledge lies in the data, and what its operating characteristics are. And because we don't know that, we also don't have a good understanding of how you use this kind of operational data to produce new knowledge and how that's different from the way you use information that you collect on a case report form or in a structured interview or in a rigidly scheduled set of study visits. So PEDSnet is based on this construct known as the learning health system cycle, in which essentially we claim there is at the point of care an interaction that is generating as almost an administrative byproduct now, what people tend to call big data, as fuzzy as that term is, and that a well-functioning learning health system will start with that data and go through an afferent process of new knowledge generation, understanding the data, extracting information from it, drawing conclusions from those data in ways that are very analogous to the ways that we conduct clinical research now. The key here is that in addition to understanding more about disease biology and patient sociology and health policy, we want to generate knowledge that's concretely going to improve patient and system outcomes. And then the back half of this circle, the efferent arm, is taking these outcomes and translating them back to practice. And again, for different, in a different forum, we can talk about principles of clinical decision support or of medical education or of patient engagement here. But the key for knowledge generation is that we need to come out of this with knowledge that can be translated back to the point of care. So how does PEDSnet fit into that structure? PEDSnet is designed intentionally as a prototype, national scale, pediatric-focused learning health system. Right? In structure, it's what we call a clinical data research network. That's a term that comes from the PCORnet network. I'll talk about that a bit more. But in practice, what it means is that we are focused principally at this point in our lifespan on collecting and analyzing health system data. So it's a collection of eight large children's hospitals who have essentially agreed up front to pool data about all of their patients, right? Mostly EHR-derived data, some administrative data, but to go through the work of pooling data, interpreting data, standardizing data in advance of any particular research need, with the expected benefit on the back end that we'll be able to support a variety of research studies, some of them observational and retrospective, some of them prospective, some of them interventional. The key health economic motivating factor here is that a well-designed randomized clinical trial gives you sort of as good protection as you can from a variety of different biases, right? In particular from the unmeasured confounding that randomization seeks to address. It does introduce a bunch of systematic biases on the other end, but it allows you to isolate effects very well. Unfortunately, a well-administered randomized controlled trial costs about $80,000 per patient to generate a result. That's per patient in the trial, not necessarily per patient ever treated, right? Study designs that are based on this kind of pre-computed data, again, not accounting for the infrastructure costs of getting it there, can reduce the cost per patient by about 2 orders of magnitude. So we can execute studies for $800 to $1,000 per patient in order to generate similar conclusions, not with the intent of replacing purpose-designed studies, or particularly not with the intent of replacing randomized clinical trials, but with the intent of augmenting traditional study designs with a data infrastructure, a collaborative infrastructure, and a regulatory infrastructure that accelerates the process of research, allows people to form and test good hypotheses, and allows us to focus the expensive study designs where we really need that kind of data. So I mentioned that there are 8 children's hospitals involved. What does that mean in terms of patients? So we have a cohort of about 5 million children for whom data are available, that those data span about a decade and a half of interactions with the health system. And you can see on the map that we're spread out across the nation with some biggish gaps that we're working to fill. One thing you will see here is that, unsurprisingly, because this is a health system network that represents children's hospitals, we do tend to have a bias towards large urban catchment areas, right? So again, this is operating in a complementary space to practice-based research networks. All right, I mentioned the concept CDRN. The other thing that's important to us as part of PEDSnet is that while we have a sort of decent starting national coverage, we also don't function on our own. We function as part of a larger national network called PCORnet, which unites 13 of these clinical data research networks, and you can see them named here and some information about where they live, that represents probably about 1/3 of the US population, right? As you might guess from most of these names, the majority of CDRNs are primarily adult-focused, but there are about 20 other hospitals in different CDRNs that are either children's hospitals or have large pediatric services. So we're operating with a cohort of about 5 million kids in a larger context that provides access to about 20 million kids. All right, let's go informatics-y for a little bit. So one of the first tasks we needed to solve in PEDSnet was how do we represent our data in order to accelerate the process of science? And in particular, what are the challenges we have to deal with? Again, these are bread and butter for folks who have to deal with these kinds of data routinely. Right? There's what we call semantic heterogeneity. So there's certainly site-to-site heterogeneity in coding practices. There's vendor-to-vendor heterogeneity. As you can see, we use different EHR systems at different sites, and they may differ in whether or not they ask you for a visit diagnosis or how they record prescription data, that sort of thing. And then there are a plethora of different vocabularies. I mean, if you just think about diagnoses, most people who are used to using large data sets say, oh yeah, diagnoses, we do that in ICD-9. Most clinicians who take care of patients have never used ICD-9 in their lives, right? You do something else that generates an ICD-9 code at the back end, but it's very, very rare that as an oncologist, I walk up to Epic and I say, this patient's diagnosis is 204.01. Or that kid's got E6 3.0, right? What I say is, this patient has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, T phenotype in remission. That's an important distinction because it means if I want to look at a variety of different data sources, I need to think about how I express those data so I can ask the same question in different places. Right. Second major issue, as anybody who's used Epic knows, EHRs are generally about taking care of patients and running businesses. They do a very good job of collecting data. They do a very good job of emitting data to pharmacies, to labs, that sort of thing. By and large, EHRs are not thinking very hard about how you manage population health, or they're not thinking very hard about how you collect research-grade data when you see the patient. There are ways to influence that, but even those ways have to be carefully approached. For instance, you can put forms in the EHR that ask people to provide you data about the overall quality of life for a patient, or about clinical trial operations, or about eligibility. Our experience, and most people's experience who have tried to insert those kind of data, is they generally don't work, right? Because clinicians are involved in seeing the patient, taking care of the patient, and then seeing the next patient. And if you let them skip your form, they will. So part of that dialogue is asking, how do we integrate this data capture into the EHR? But for the most part, we're dealing with data that were collected as part of routine clinical operations. And then the other challenge that we face in pediatrics is that kids are not little adults. Kids have different kinds of outcomes. In particular, when we want to find out how an adult is healthy, many population studies ask things like, did you survive more than 30 days? Thankfully, not a major outcome for kids, right? But we're asking all the time, how well did you grow, right? If I ask about drug utilization in an adult, I'm usually asking, what drug did you get, and maybe for how long did you get it, right? If I'm asking the same thing in children, what dose gets to be very important, because there isn't a standard dose for everybody. So we need to think about how to address those pediatric challenges. So what PEDSnet is aiming for is data that are standardized to what we call a common data model, a common representation, that are as at least in structure, ready to be picked up and used for observational and prospective research. I want to be careful about how literally I make that statement because, again, as I said 2 slides ago, one of the things that's very true about health system data is you don't get to specify what the data are, right? Unlike a research study case report form, you get to specify how you use the data. And we want these data to be usable not only for big population level studies, but actually to reach out to patients, recruit them to clinical trials and prospective studies. So what do I mean when I say a common data model? What I mean, for instance, is here's a way that 3 different sites might look at office visits in their EHR. If you look at an Epic schedule, I'm sure you've seen some of the terms in Site 1. Right? All of these in common represent outpatient visits, maybe with or without procedures. So what we want to do is take this set and say, in a common data model, we have a common set, so everybody who comes to see a clinician in the outpatient setting is labeled an ambulatory visit, not an allied health visit, an office visit, a procedure visit, a lab visit, so that we can ask the same questions, and so on. So this involves mapping from local terms to a standardized vocabulary up front. The model we use in particular is based on a construct called the OMOP Common Data Model. OMOP stands for Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, and it's a model that has been expanded and validated over the past 7 to 8 years to look at health services data and to make it easier to ask questions across multiple sites in a repeatable way. So it helps to address our goal of supporting open science. Right? We picked this one Because it accommodates a variety of data types, it gives direct access to the data that we use most frequently, and in particular because it has a very strong focus on getting that terminologic standardization done up front. So why would we care about standardizing terminology? Right? One of the things we can say is, I know what that patient has. So you're going to see some oncology examples up here. I apologize for the domain specificity, but you ask an oncologist to talk, it's what you get. So I went off the leukemia space. If I look at the set of patients who had brain tumors at a particular institution, what I'll get back is counts of patients with these 20-odd diagnoses, right? And these are what happen when you use ICD as your coding standard, right? ICD is intended as a mortality index and secondarily as a billing system. Right? And so you can find out whether the tumors are benign or malignant and maybe whether they're a primary brain tumor or not, although that's not so reliable. But you're not getting into the information about histology or phenotype that you want. On the other hand, the EHR actually is telling you a fair amount more about it. So if you look a little more deeply, there actually is a lot of information about histology there. Because what happens is when I, a clinician, sit down to write down a diagnosis on a patient, I'm interacting with a commercial terminology called intelligent medical objects, or IMO, which is sort of runs riot in its proliferation of terms, and then connects to a variety of standard terminologies. It turns out ICD is one of the least expressive of those terminologies because it's trying to optimize for something else. So retaining that standardization up front from the source terminology lets us get at this wealth of information about the actual biology of patients' diseases. The second thing that terminology standardization gets us is the ability to collect things and navigate the relationships between terms. So I picked a really simple example here. When you type a prescription into Epic, Epic is interested in getting a substance to the patient, a bottle of something. So it turns out there are 100 different ways in the vocabulary that meaningful use exchanges prescription data in. Right? There are actually about 600 different ways in the vocabulary that Epic uses to prescribe drugs. And if you wanted to know who got amoxicillin liquid for their otitis media, every time you wrote that query, you would have to write down 600 to 700 different terms if you were going to do this in a reproducible way. Or you could say, hey, I know what all those terms are in my EHR. I'm only going to include those 50 or 60, but my query won't run anyplace else. Or you can say, well, my EHR has a thing called pharmacologic class, so I want to know who got amoxicillin. Dang, there's no pharmacologic class for amoxicillin. There's beta-lactams, so I can tell you who got amox and who got augmented, but that's the whole point of my study. Right? So what the vocabulary standardization gets you is the ability to traverse that hierarchy and say, I want amoxicillin, I want only amoxicillin, and I want amoxicillin as a liquid that people took. Right? And then it will go find the 700 other terms for you and take care of the job. All right, I've talked a little bit about the theory. What does the practice look like? So in PEDSnet, what we have are 8 sites who extract data from their EHR and data warehouses. At the sites, what they will do is go through the process of transforming 2 standard vocabularies following an agreed-upon set of specifications. And like every sort of large-scale distributed development project, we use things like GitHub to help manage version control and communication. And what that does is results in a central data network that has information in the OMOP common data model that we then execute studies against. Right? It also feeds forward into a similar data model, a little more claims focused, called the PCORnet common data model. So when we're talking to other sites in PCORnet, we're speaking the same language as they are. Right? So we have these 2 sort of outgoing directions for collaboration. How much work is involved? So I mentioned we had about 5 million patients. You can see we have about 750 million facts about those patients. So lab values, heights and weights, what drugs they got, in some cases what drugs were dispensed, but that's for a minority. What we've done for these patients, sometimes unfortunately to these patients, why we think we're doing it, and so on. Okay. Just to give you a quick kind of table 1-ish summary, it's about what you would expect from a large pediatric center or a large pediatric network, about half of the sites having primary care networks, right? So you can see that about half the kids are seen within the past 18 months. We have about the age distribution you would expect. We have, again, the gender distribution. Because we have mostly large urban centers in the northern half of the United States, you can see we relatively overrepresent African Americans. We relatively underrepresent at least people who self-identify as Hispanic or Latino. All right, so I've talked about getting the data together. Obviously, the data are not much use to you if they're not any good. So Levon is going to spend some time talking about what we do to try to clean up the data and make sure it's in as usable condition as we can.
So I'm going to be talking about our data quality assessment program, which is what, when I was a fellow and approached by Charlie and Tony about one of my activities in my second year, what I kind of took on. And here, when we talk about data quality, the goal here is try to make this data as useful as possible so that it can be, PEDSnet can be of use to the researchers. However, there's limited guidelines or even consensus on how you do this with EHR data, how you define valid data or high quality data. And really, quality is in the eye of the beholder. The informaticist, when you're building these things, you want to make sure I'm matching the data model, I'm putting data that I've taken from the source system, that I'm matching that, and then I want to make sure that I've got my accuracy, that I'm internally valid. Did I handle the data correctly in all these steps and the transformations that I did of taking it from one vocabulary to another? The researcher, they want to make sure that the data they're going to query from PEDSnet reflects key clinical facts, what really is going on in the patient's pathophysiology, and their accuracy is kind of making sure that this matches what's out there in the real world, that it's an external validity measure. So when we were thinking about how to begin our data quality assessment program, I did this with Ritu Kare, who's here. So basically, we looked at Michael Kahn's framework. Michael Kahn has been involved in PEDSnet as well. And basically, we came up with these 4 types of data quality checks. We were going to focus on the fidelity, kind of getting at what the informaticist's goal was, making sure that the data in PEDSnet accurately reflects what was in the source system. Consistency, that we map that data correctly. So many people may be capturing the same diagnosis, same medication in a different vocabulary at their site, but can we make sure that gets mapped into a common concept when it hits PEDSnet? Accuracy, making sure the degree to which we define as the degree to which PEDSnet data correctly reflects the clinical characteristics of patients. And feasibility, basically measuring the degree to which the data is actually collected and available in our network. And when we were starting this, we were going to start it by looking at these first 2 levels, and this is what we've done for many iterations now, focusing on the single data elements, making sure that these are correctly captured, and looking for detections of exceptions and errors. An example here is that if we screen for an inpatient encounter, we want to make sure that the start date happened before the end date. Surprisingly, this happens more often than not, that you can get data back from the EHR that the dates don't make sense. And then later on, and things that we're going to start doing soon, hopefully, are externally validating our data. Charlie had alluded to this idea that if we had some dispensing data from the pharmacies, which we do from some of our sites, that we can reconcile that with the actual medication orders that are also present in PEDSnet, and benchmark this against what are accepted as gold standards out there, possibly replicating prior known good analyses and seeing how does PEDSnet data hold up to that. So we knew we weren't the first network to have to deal with data quality issues, or DQA as I've summarized here. And so this is just 2 examples, the HMO Research Network and the Mini Sentinel, and a lot of similarities in how they approach data quality. They want to make sure there's compliance with the CDM, that there's consistency there. They will do some summary statistics, making sure that you can quickly look and see, like, does the average number of visits for a patient, the average number of diagnoses, et cetera, how does that vary between. Look for missingness. Missingness is a big thing, like how, and does that change from cycle to cycle? So trends over time are very big for us, and you'll see elements of that when we discuss some of our checks that we adopted. And so kind of looking at how we would approach data quality in one cycle. So every quarter we're getting data from sites that is being uploaded. When we get that single site's first data, we have put together a large number of automated data quality checks. A lot of this was done manually first, but Ritu's done an amazing job automating so much of this, where we have our scripts that will run across each of our tables of interest, our domains. We'll come up with the automatic counts and distributions, graphical representations, which when Ritu and I in the next step will look at them, they help us with very quickly identifying outliers or these changes in time, and then warnings about, if we know certain values should not be there, if certain dates are implausible or impossible, that will alert us to that. And so Ritu and I form these two expert reviewers, and we'll review every site's report, look at these warnings, look at how this compares to previous cycles, if there were things that should have been fixed from the last data upload, were they fixed, try to assign a possible cause to this data, and then we will communicate this to them in GitHub, which serves as a nice repository for issue tracking. And then previously we used to do phone calls with the sites that could be very long and involved, but now they can go on there, pick the issues that we present to them, and this is an example of what one of our reports would look like, that they would, a graphical representation here, this happens to be gender, making sure that we have the two genders that we expect, or an unknown category, but were there any other unusual values got added here? We then try and also rank the issues to help the sites, the data analysts. This is not their only project, so they would like to know what are the biggest issues, most pressing issues. Rankings were something that we developed here that we thought were fix the issues that are going to have the highest impact on research first, and then prioritize from there. So just some examples of some of the types of checks, and these are actual issues we found. We make sure, like with that CDM, we talk about, are we violating formal specifications? So race and ethnicity early on were sometimes getting mixed up and put into the wrong data, and making sure that was not done. Or implausible events. Sometimes we have death dates that are in the future, and we say, how did that happen? Or heights, Tom Thumb here, 6 centimeters. We don't ask sites to look at these things, but if this is actually what is in the source system, like these sometimes vital signs or biometric data gets entered inappropriately, we keep it there in PEDSnet, and just we are just aware that this data might pop up, and we can keep track of this so that we can tell researchers if they ask us, yes, we know this is a known data issue. Or we look at outliers, things that is diabetes really the most frequent condition, or was there a bad join between tables? Why is one provider doing 2 million measurements? Is this just a standard workflow thing that every lab gets assigned to this one provider when it makes its way into our data model? And then discontinuities, and where the visualization helps, when things change between, when we see each cycle sudden jumps. It could be that a new system has gone online, something has changed in the lab, that they're using a new way of recording their data that maybe the site didn't pick up on. And so these kinds of changes are really valuable to us to help the sites be vigilant for changes within their home systems. And so just in summary, now we've gone through 9 data cycles. Not all sites were present in the first cycle, but we basically identified over 2,100 data quality issues. The most common ones we deal with are these ETL, or extract, transform, load issues, which are often in the process of taking the data from the source system into the PEDSnet common data model. What happened? Was there a coding issue? And these are things that are usually fixable. So feedback to the sites can lead to that issue disappearing in the next cycle. Characteristic issues are things that are kind of inherent in the source data, and you can't necessarily fix them, in which case we're kind of curating and keeping track of what those issues might be. And then non-issues are when we raise a flag about something and the site assures us, no, really, this patient has been here 3 years. That was not a mistake. That's why they have millions of vital signs. And then this other one, ITP transform issues, which was just different data models and how we're getting the data that I won't go into. So kind of looking at these 9 cycles in time, an interesting thing that you see here is that as we go through the cycles, not only the red line here represents the number of data quality issues, the blue line here represents the data quality checks that we've implemented. When we first started, we had to take a guess at what kind of data quality checks we should automate or what we could have. But then as we started seeing the data, we started learning. So we kind of developed our own learning curve. And as we saw certain issues occurring, we started automating and adding new checks for them. So over time, that number of checks that we have has evolved to over 600 checks now. And then certain jumps in the data represent times when we changed the data model, that we didn't hit everybody with everything in the first data cycle. And between cycle 1 and 2, some sites joined, so they didn't have data initially with us. Between cycles 2 and 5, we were dealing with the addition of the drug exposure table and measurements table, which includes lab data and vital sign data. So these were huge jumps in data, and whenever you introduce a new data or ask for a new data source, there are likely to be more issues during that time. And so that's why we saw a jump in issues there. Usually once people got a hang of things, then we have a decrease in the number of issues, but then that's the perfect time to introduce new changes and new requirements. And so again, the issues jump up. And we look at what types of issues we're seeing data quality causes across the time. Initially, in this red here is ETL issues. This was the most common thing in the very first cycle, but that was the last time it was the most common. That after that, so over time, as our sites, our data analysts at each site have gotten better, as our common data model, as our instructions have gotten more specific, sometimes it was on us not having ambiguous instructions on what data to pull. ETL issues became smaller and smaller and smaller over time. The one thing that has grown is the data characteristic issues. Those keep growing, and partly that's because as we improve the data or remove ETL issues, we're sometimes discovering new data quality issues, these new data characteristic issues that we keep track of. Not surprisingly, when we kind of summarize them, there are many other subtypes of characteristic and ETL issues, but by far, data characteristic issues are the most common that we encounter, 83%, 9% being the ETL, 8% other, which includes some issues that are under review, have not fully been resolved yet. We also deal with just looking at where these issues are occurring and what domains. So, as I mentioned, medication and labs and vitals came later. They are some of the biggest ones, so those are ones where we have sometimes the most issues. And then ones that are probably the least issues occur when things like demographics table, and that also kind of lends to the fact that these data analysts are very experienced at each site. They work on data research, other research networks, registries, other data requests. So that's like your table 1 that they're just so used to pulling. So that's usually a less complicated field. And what kind of issue is the most common? So missing data and outliers tend to be the over 50% of the issues we encounter. Now, this doesn't mean you're missing all the data. If you are missing 2% of your data, we're going to flag you, and we're going to say this. Some sites don't record certain fields at all, and that might be 100% missing. Some sites don't have the gestational age. It's not captured in a way in their EHR that is accessible to us, so they might be 100% missing there. They each count as one hit, and so they just add up as a data issue. And then a part of why you have to keep doing this is that almost 10% of the time, unexpected differences between cycles, you kind of have to be vigilant for a change in the source systems, or even a change in the code may inadvertently break a process that was working. And so you need to be vigilant for these changes and let the sites know, why did this shift by 50%, why did this double, et cetera. So just in conclusion, about just from our data quality aspect of this talk, a strong post-hoc program is important in assessing data quality. As the research network matures, the percentage of EDL issues are probably going to decrease, and that data quality is going to improve over time. It's an evolving process. And so our next steps are going to be trying to implement some of those higher-level checks that I mentioned and further automate the data quality checks. Ritu and I have gotten very good at this. It just takes us much less time than it used to, but still more time than we'd like to spend. And so now Charlie's going to talk about using our data for research.
All right, so the slide says it all, right? We've talked so far about everything we can do to make the data as usable as possible, but if you can't get to the data, then it's not doing a whole lot of good for patients. So what we're working on is building pathways to let people connect with the data. We start with the most straightforward types of access. These are the ones that have the lowest risk to patient privacy because they're generally presenting aggregate data, but they give you some insight into what's going on. So I'm giving you, for instance, a quick display here using an Odyssey tool called Achilles of data in the network for acute respiratory infections. And this tells you it's a fairly high prevalence diagnosis. It tells you it's much more prevalent in younger kids. Yeah, back up. It tells you that it's more common in the winter, and it tells you that it's much more common in outpatient settings than it is in inpatient settings. So you get a sense of what the overall quality of the data might be. Once you've been able to kind of get your orientation around individual facts, we try to provide a low barrier of entry to exploring what a cohort might look like. So I'm showing you here, for instance, how you might look up kids who had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease who had in the course of their care a requirement for emergency care. Right? And the idea here is to present the data to you, allow you to select the criteria within fairly narrow bounds that are important to establishing a cohort, and then with the right sort of security and IRB approval, actually get at a data set with minimal identifiers so that you can take those data away and identify them. So this helps us address the sort of most straightforward feasibility questions, population identification, cohort or case finding questions. If you have the time to invest a little bit in the structure of the data and in the way things link up to each other, you can move to the next step and ask, okay, how do I construct a cohort based on that will mirror the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria for my study? And so there's a tool called Atlas that you can use that asks you basically to list out your criteria, and you can use things like Boolean logic to select for combinations of diagnoses or treatments. This allows you to impose temporal constraints and so on. And then you can go off and get the cohort. And what you get back is either a sort of data quality view, or you can get a sort of quick feasibility assessment stratified by diagnoses of interest, that sort of thing. This is not Atlas output, but this is at the moment another tool that we're using, but same principle applies, that what we're doing here is breaking down kids with rheumatologic disorders and nephrotic syndromes, and asking what are the age and sex distributions. Again, so you can assess case counts for a study, so you can look at whether you're seeing the expected female predominance, the expected adolescent incidence, things like that, right? The other side of the question is that's kind of a self-service look at the data, or an assisted look at the data when you want to have a conversation with us about criteria and data models. We also want to make it more possible to conduct studies in the network. So our data coordinating center and the data science group within that offers what we call data science consultations, basically conversations about translating a study question into the kind of language that you can apply to the data, as well as the actual formulation and execution of complex queries. The other piece of work that the DCC manages is the connection out to that national network and participation in PCORnet studies. In addition to the DCC, PEDSnet has what's called a methods advisory panel. So it's a senior biostatistician from each institution that reviews proposed studies for validity of statistical methods, for applicability of methods to the kinds of data that are present, and really to help people who are trying to design studies put together a stronger analysis plan or a stronger grant application, and ultimately an analytic structure that's more likely to succeed in the network. It's an informatics talk, so I'm not going into it in detail, but the third thing that PEDSnet has focused on is developing the regulatory and administrative collaborations, so that doing an 8-site study is a matter of coming to the DCC with a proposal and getting your data, and not going and finding 8 different IRB protocols and 8 different data use agreements and so on. So what are the opportunities here? So I'm going to be very quick, but a couple of things that we think are important, and so we focused on in structuring the network. It's really important to capture primary data. So what I'm showing you here are data about body mass index. So I've actually picked BMI measurements for girls here, and if you spend a lot of time staring at growth charts, what you see is a pretty familiar BMI curve. So the red curve here is what you get out of the scale of something like PEDSnet, a very tight line that actually is pretty close to the expected values from NHANES, this dotted line. What you don't get, that national samples have to contend with, is this really large amount of hysteresis toward the end, because you're dealing with 50 or 60 data points per measurement rather than 5,000 or 6,000 data points per measurement. The other thing that primary data gives you is a better insight into your patients. If you want to know who's obese in the network and who may be at risk for complications of obesity, ask what their BMI is. If you use administrative data, it's not something we're real good at pediatricians. So unless you were seen in a weight management clinic, there's a better than 2 in 3 chance that you're going to misclassify your patients if what you use is diagnosis data out of your EHR, out of claims, out of anywhere. And this is not a matter of ICD-9 versus SNOMED. This is just a matter of whether the fact that the patient was at risk for metabolic syndrome was, from a clinical operations perspective, important enough to make it into the list of diagnoses, right? And those criteria are different from what's important enough to take care of the patient. All right. You can use these data to actually do effectiveness studies in a way that is similar to the kinds of study designs we're used to. So what I'm showing you here is a Cox proportional hazards model looking at the likelihood of going into clinical remission if your IBD was treated with a TNF-alpha antagonist versus steroids or antimetabolites alone, right? And so you can generate effectiveness as applied in the real world estimates. Those are subject to the kinds of confounding that observational data gives you, but they also give you some confidence that what you're seeing is as patients are treated rather than subject to the Hawthorne effect. You can look for signal. You can take advantage of the economy of scale to detect things like if children are exposed to broad spectrum antibiotics in the first 2 years of life, they actually have an increased risk with a dose response of being obese later in childhood. Again, whether that's a causal association or not is a very open question, but it gives you an opportunity to detect these signals that are harder to detect in unstructured or inconsistent data, and then use those to ground hypotheses for further study. So I'm actually going to skip through this fairly quickly for the basis of time and look at what kinds of currently active studies we have. And again, I apologize for a little bit of an eye chart here, but what I'm pointing out is that we have about 15 studies currently active in PEDSnet, all of whom have been kind enough to help us in our data toddlerhood assess data quality issues, data capture issues. They range from safety issues like reducing radiation exposures or looking at secondary malignancies in patients treated for autoimmune disease to clinical practice issues, things like the impact of obesity on outcomes for common childhood issues, right, to study of rarer diseases, so identification of patients with glomerular disease and then impact on their bone health, right? So variety of study topics, variety of study designs. Our goal here is actually to maintain a mix of high prevalence, high impact, we hope, health services questions with the kinds of rarer questions that we hope can generate hypotheses or generate opportunities to connect clinical to omics data in studying rarer diseases. All of this, however, depends on our ability to accurately identify the patients that we want to study. And so I'm going to toss the baton back to Levon for the home lab to talk about how we address phenotyping of patients.
All right, we're in the home stretch. So to achieve that end that Charlie just mentioned, we are going to talk about computable phenotypes now. And I think we're all familiar from even high school biology what a phenotype is, that we're trying to see like what are the traits that get expressed out of that genetic information that underpins your height, your eye color, blood type, maybe even your predisposition to a disease. Computable phenotype would be if there's a way based on that you can take a clinical condition, characteristic, or a set of clinical features that you can determine solely from data in the EHR that you would say this matches a patient with hypertension, a patient who's obese, etc. So why use these phenotypes? So traditional identification of patients relies on billing data. That's what we've had the longest, most experience with. But you can be more accurate than methods that rely on billing data alone. You'll be less at risk, for instance, of miscoding. That if things are, as you'll see, we're going to talk about an inflammatory bowel disease example, sometimes that can be miscoded as, from Crohn's to ulcerative colitis and vice versa. You can also improve your accuracy of identifying patients by using multiple clinical elements to support your determination that this is a patient with this diagnosis. You can also, and again with this more complex patient identification, we can take that Boolean logic that people have provided to us and create very complex algorithms with multiple inclusion-exclusion criteria. And this can also aid in new patient identification, that basically this patient meets the criteria based on biometric data that maybe says they have hypertension, but no one has gone to the trouble of putting it in the problem list, but oh look, the kid is also on an antihypertensive medication. I'm pretty sure they have high blood pressure. So approaches to phenotyping can rely on structured data or unstructured data. Structured data being what we are used to seeing in the EHR diagnosis codes, procedure codes, lab tests, biometric data, versus narrative information in clinical notes or impressions from radiology, which are definitely in the EHR, but maybe not as accessible. You can take that structured data, and when we work with these people, domain experts, who have an idea, or they are the source of knowledge about what the phenotype they would expect it to be and how it would be represented in the EHR data, they can tell us the data they want, and with a clinical informatician, we can identify and extract that data for them. Versus if it's unstructured data, given that there are hundreds of ways that you can describe a patient being hypertensive, febrile, have an ear infection, that you need machines to do natural language processing or text mining to identify very relevant keywords. You have to spend a lot of time training on developing a data set that you can validate and train your algorithm on that. Very time-consuming process before you can actually get useful data out of it. So we've adopted to using structured data as our approach to the phenotypes we're going to talk about. And so the idea being that if you can combine all these different data elements, then in this Venn diagram, the ones that have the most overlap are probably more likely to be your true cases once you combine all these different data that could be available to you in the EHR. So just as an example, it was one of the studies that Charlie had up earlier. This is a phenotype validation for Crohn's disease. And so basically we defined Crohn's disease as being any patient in our PEDSnet network that had a Crohn's disease diagnosis code, 555.x, and that they were on medications for Crohn's disease. I will not read this list. The exclusion criteria is that they want to make sure that, like I said, there's miscoding or just the possibility that early on this kid was thought to have IBD. Maybe they diagnosed this as, instead of Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. So sometimes these children will have both diagnoses codes on their records. One of the exclusion criteria was to say, okay, if they have more diagnoses for ulcerative colitis than Crohn's disease, then exclude them, since they're more likely that. We may be missing some Crohn's disease kids who got diagnosed later, but still, we want to be careful here. So just looking across PEDSnet and some prevalence data, these are raw counts across our 8 sites, that you can see that if you only require a single Crohn's disease diagnosis to occur, the prevalent, you get about 9,400 patients. Once you set the bar a higher threshold, that jumps up to about 7,000 patients if you require at least 3 diagnoses. If you take one diagnosis and combine it with the requirement to have medications, you get only 7,700 patients, or 0.15% of our patients with PEDSnet. And again, you up the number of diagnoses, and you'll drop that number more. So you're probably sacrificing or losing some patients who may actually have Crohn's disease, but you're probably much more sure, if you were going to bet, that these are the patients that have it. And then just to show, like, if we looked at any GI diagnosis occurrence that was not Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, we could hit over 1 million patients. And this can vary between our 8 sites, that you could see this prevalence is anywhere from 0.04% to 0.24%. So you could say that's about 40 per 100,000 kids or 240 per 100,000 kids. There are, looking at the literature, there are very different definitions of what the actual prevalence of Crohn's disease is in children, owing to the fact that they define it by different age ranges and such. One of the more recent ones I saw for children under the age of 20, they would say that it's closer to 43 per 100,000. So maybe one of the things that we have to do with our validation, making sure that our phenotype is good, is also considering the fact that we are looking at tertiary hospitals. So this may not be truly representative of every child out there, like in terms of our denominator. Or these kids also gravitate towards our tertiary centers, and that's why our prevalence is higher. So to kind of look and see how well our models are doing, we can do logistic regression, where we can take our criteria that we use to build our phenotypes and treat those as exposure variables, and then look at outcomes that are specific to the diagnosis of interest. So here we took a cohort of patients with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis or any other GI diagnosis. We start with that as our pool of patients, and then we say, okay, which patients have a continuous variable here of Crohn's disease diagnoses, and also a binary variable here of Crohn's disease meds, whether or not they were on any of the meds that we specified earlier. And we look to see, do they have visits to GI clinic? Did they have an endoscopy? Did they have GI radiologic studies? We look at some odds ratios and 95% confidence intervals, and we see that just looking at diagnosis data alone, that it was predictive of having any of these outcomes. But if we look at Crohn's disease medications alone, they pretty similar if we're going to a GI clinic, not surprising that if you're on a Crohn's disease med, you should be there, but much higher predictive values, odds ratios that you would have endoscopy done or have a radiologic study done. And so this just shows that, when we're using computable phenotypes, the diagnosis codes alone are not sufficient in developing optimal patient identification algorithms. You throw in these extra data elements, and you can have better predictors that this is the true case that you're looking for. And our next step is going to be taking this Crohn's disease phenotype and many others that we've been working on and do some chart reviews to validate them and see if we can look at what we called true cases, near cases, and see how they differ and if we can improve our phenotypes further. So just as we wrap up here, I wanted to provide a slide talking about accessing PEDSnet. You can go to PEDSnet.org, and you can see, as Charlie talked about, requesting feasibility or studies, looking to collaborate, trying to launch a study. And of course, we'd like to acknowledge the work of our PEDSnet DCC, which is here at CHOP. Many people here in the auditorium, thank you for all your work in developing PEDSnet. And all of the work that we presented here was collaboration with all of these people, could not be done without them. Our leadership for PEDSnet, Michael Kahn, as I mentioned before, Christopher Forrest here, our PI, and all the different informatics teams, their data analysts, the Odyssey Consortium, and the patients and families who allowed their data to be used in this. So, thank you.
Thank you.